Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Farwa Aamer, the Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York. And today I'm truly delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Arvind Panagariya, the Chairman of the 16th Finance Commission in India. Dr. Panagariya, welcome. It's truly an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Farwa.
For those who may not be familiar with Dr. Panagariya's distinguished career, a little bit of a background on him. From 2015 to 2017, Dr. Panagariya was the first Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, the Government of India's premier policy think tank. During this time, he was also the India's G20 Sherpa. Over the years, he's also worked with the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank in various capacities. He's on leave from Columbia University, where he has served as the Professor of Economics and the Jagdish Bhagpati Professor of Indian Political Economy. A prolific writer, he has authored and edited over 20 books, and his scholarship on economics is widely recognized. For his immense contributions, the Government of India awarded Dr. Panagariya with the Padma Bhushan in 2012, one of the country's highest civilian awards. Dr. Panagariya joins us at a pivotal time. India's ascent on the global stage has been remarkable in the last couple of years, and its economy is poised to be the third largest by 2030. But of course, this path comes with its challenges, from navigating global uncertainties to leveraging domestic strengths. It's a long way to go. It's also a timely conversation because just last week, Prime Minister Modi met with President Trump in Washington, D.C., where economic and trade ties took center stage. So I can't wait to hear more from the expert himself. So without further ado, let's just dive straight into it. Dr. Panagariya, if I could start with a big picture question here. India has this massive ambition of becoming a developed country by 2047. And of course, the economy is projected to be the third largest by 2030, as I spoke in my intro. However, with a rapidly growing population and the recent forecast that the growth will remain sluggish in the upcoming fiscal year, how do you see these targets, how realistic they are, and what should be the key policy and economic priorities for India to actualize this vision? So over to you.
Very good question, Farwa. First of all, thank you for having me here for the podcast. Really pleasure to be with you. Now, the discourse, particularly in the electronic media, but perhaps to some degree also in the print media, gets to be dominated largely by very short-term news because, the interest of the media as well as the people who are watching the media is more into kind of, day-to-day, what was the latest development today? Also, the negative news generally dominates. Currently there seems to be some skepticism about India's prospects going forward because growth rate in the current fiscal year, which will be ending on the 31st of March of this year, this is the 24-25 fiscal year of India, has slowed down a bit, after 8.2% annual growth the previous year. This year, we'll probably end up with something like 6.5%. So it's a little bit of decline. But it's still, by all means, by all measures, a respectable growth rate. And of course, for among the large economies of the world, this is still the highest, by far, actually, the fastest growing economy. I take a more longer term view of the growth process. And once I put that context to your question, I think things look a lot more optimistic, a lot more bullish. So if I take, the time period 2003 to 2019, just before COVID hit, India grew about 10.9% in current dollars. And with 1.9% being the GDP deflator for the United States, if we convert this into real growth rate in dollar terms, that translates into something like 9%. And this is the period during which we had the global financial crisis in 2008. India itself actually had an internal kind of financial markets crisis because of very large non-performing assets in the banking system. And then it spilled over into the non-bank finance companies, that is NBFCs as well. And yet, in dollar terms, really, current dollars 10.9%, in real dollars 9%. That's quite a growth. Even if we take the COVID years, and so we take full period 2003 to 2023, India has grown 10% in current dollars, 7.7% in real dollars. So I think it looks pretty good if I project that. So even if we assume, something about, let's say, 10% in current dollars, in 10 years' time, by 2034, India will become $10 trillion. And its nearest rival below will be Germany, which will be less than 7 trillion. So India will already actually in 10 years' time, if it manages to repeat what it has done over this 21-year period, with 2 or 3 of these major kind of setbacks happening, from the global financial crisis to internal financial crisis to COVID, then we really get to 10 trillion. And as regards the Viksit Bharat or developed country status for India in 2047, now this is my calculation, that India's per capita income in 2023 in current dollars is about 2,520, something of that sort, about, roughly say 2,500 plus. Now, to get to the Viksit Bharat or developed country status using the World Bank definition of high income country, India will need to have an income, per capita income of $14,000 in 2047, but in 2023 prices, in 2023 dollars. That requires per capita income to grow by 7.6% a year. Given what I have said, that India actually grew for GDP, the GDP grew 9% from 2003 to 19, and even from 2003 to 2023, it grew 7.7%. That is the GDP. Per capita GDP growing at 7.6 is not out of the realm of the possible at all. Because population will grow another, let's say, 0.5 or 0.6% during this period. That requires GDP to grow about 8.2%, which is somewhere in the middle of the 7.7 and 9% growth rate that India has already seen, the numbers that I have quoted. So I think this is very much a reachable goal. Now, how it will unfold, of course, depends on many different factors about which we can speak.
No, thank you so much. As a student of economics, this is very interesting to me, and it's also good to hear that you feel optimistic regarding these visions, that they're achievable. But one thing you highlight is, of course, if India is able to do what it has managed to do in the past 21 years, and that's where I would like to bring this conversation to the short term. You've often said that global market shifts, global uncertainties worry you less, and it's what's happening within India that needs utmost attention and addressing. So if I could just request you to elaborate on that, what are some of the most pressing structural challenges that India is currently facing? I know agricultural and manufacturing sectors are important points of conversation. And what kind of reforms are required, whether it's in these sectors and otherwise, in the short to medium term, in order to sort of get India to continue doing what it's doing correct and making sure that it makes improvements for its economy to grow?
Very good question. Very good question. So first, why I think, the foreign market, or what happens in the external market, is not such a large source of worry. Lot of this pessimism about the external markets comes from the fact of these, trade sanctions and retaliatory tariffs that have gone on between United States and China, and then also the sanctions against Russia, and therefore the market disruption. There is also issues with the WTO not functioning in the way it is supposed to function, the way it has been functioning for several decades. The reason I downplay that fact is that, look, in the end, markets have an incredible power to find their way. What has happened, if you look at, pre-COVID peak, the global exports were about, 25 trillion for the merchandise, the 19 trillion for merchandise exports, and $6 trillion for services export. So total of $25 trillion was the global marketplace at its peak before COVID. That was 2018. Now, after that, we had or just around then or after that, we had that U.S.-China retaliatory tariffs. We had the sanctions, we had COVID and all. But the post-COVID peak now has gone for merchandise exports from 19 trillion to 25 trillion, for services trade from 6 trillion to 7 trillion. So the global market is today significantly larger than it was before COVID. And it is probably a multiple of what it was when China actually started its growth. So if you think in that perspective, India faces a much larger global economy today than China did, or than we had even before COVID. So this is the reason I think, the global marketplace is not going to be a serious restriction, serious constraint on India's growth. Question is, can India, say, double its share in the global marketplace from about 2% in merchandise exports to 4%, and in services exports, let's say, from a little below 4% to at least 7-8%. I think if it can do that, then I think, we are rolling and there is enough space in the global economy. Now, that brings us to the challenges domestically. So India's big challenge today is not so much growth. I think growth will happen for the kind of scenario that I have pointed out. A lot of good things happening also. Demography is in India's favor, but also the government has done a tremendous job. India's infrastructure, if you look at it, is completely transformed in the last 4 or 5 years. The kinds of highways that are being built, kinds of bridges that are being built, kinds of even the parliamentary building, new one that was built recently, or some of the coastal highway that was built in Bombay, one of the major kind of bridges that was built called Atal Setu. Fantastic. So all of this is reason for optimism. But the challenge, of course, is that today India still is struggling in terms of creating good jobs for the people. Unemployment is not India's problem. If you look at the unemployment data, they've been, in fact, declining. And the last estimate is roughly about 3.5% or so. So unemployment is not India's problem. What is the problem is underemployment. It's the output per worker, which is quite low. And why that is low is embedded in the structure of the workforce. Today, about 46% of India's workforce is in agriculture. Another 40% roughly is in these very small enterprises, which each employs less than 10 workers. So when you are working in such small enterprises, which have hardly any capital, and likewise in agriculture, you're working on these very small farms, less than half a hectare. Half of India's farms are about less than half a hectare. So your labor productivity output per worker is very low. And the challenge India faces is bringing this large workforce out of these employments into larger enterprises, whether it be goods or services. Manufacturing services, both could employ them, but we need larger employment in this corporate kind of sector, which today employs probably 7 or 8% of the workforce. So that is the challenge, and of course, which means that some expansion of the labor-intensive industry, and therefore there are concomitant reforms related to the labor markets, because India's labor market are among the most inflexible ones. So you need labor market reforms. Also something related to the land markets, because urban land, which is where most of the enterprises want to locate, and they need vast amounts of land to really do manufacturing activities, that requires relatively low-priced urban land. And in India, again, urban land tends to be both difficult to get and is very expensive. So it is a factor markets issue, which India will need to address as we go forward in the coming decades. The workforce needs to come out of both part of the workforce. Of course, you'll always need agriculture, so you'll still have about 25 to 30% workforce in agriculture always. But this excess part of it, about 15 to 20%, needs to move out into industry and services and more productive kind of larger enterprises. So that, I think, is the challenge. Also, some of the employment from the micro and small enterprises needs to move into larger enterprises. That, I think, is the challenge. But that is also the opportunity. Because what that tells you is that a very large part of the workforce is employed currently in activities that have relatively low productivity. And given that low productivity and the fact that technology today exists with some capital accumulation, existing technology and some skill acquisition can allow you to really raise the productivity, because after all, China's per capita income today is closer to $14,000, $15,000. South Korea is even more. And of course, the US is yet more. So given the existing technology, such high productivities can be achieved. And India is still at a very low productivity level. And so these are the reasons, I think, both challenges as well as the opportunities that exist for India.
And thank you so much for that. It's a very important distinction between underemployment and unemployment that you make here. But in terms of better opportunities, I'm just going to prompt you on something that you said, better opportunities for this large sort of human capital that has this potential to drive productivity within India.
Yes.
What's the landscape for business? We talk a lot about developing Asia and ease of doing business in Asia. How do you see the ease of doing business in India currently?
Right. No, this is another very good question. And that is, to some degree, a challenge, but it is also, again, an opportunity. Right. Because opportunity first, because it's a very large labor market. It's a large country. And therefore, if you want to build supply chains, as in China, there's a lot of scope. Right. So, ultimately, if you're thinking of smaller countries like, say, Vietnam or Cambodia or even Indonesia, supply chains will have to be spread over much larger number of countries. India being so large itself and having a diverse and large workforce, it provides that kind of opportunity. Its challenge also is in terms of what I said, labor laws in India need to be amended, changed. Now, the Parliament has actually voted a new set of labor laws, but they still need to be implemented. So I think that is a solvable problem once the government actually finds the right window to implement the labor laws that the Parliament has already passed or enacted. I think the market, the problem, inflexibility, rigidities of labor markets will to considerable degree be addressed. Whatever will remain can be addressed by the states themselves, because the new laws actually give states also certain powers. So that is on the labor laws. Now, land, with which also is very closely connected with the process of urbanization, is a bigger challenge in India. Because this is a state subject, and states have to come forward. But then again, the good news in India is that it being a state subject, all you need is some 4 or 5 states to actually take the action. And luckily, some of the states have very forward-looking chief ministers in India. You got Gujarat, you got Andhra Pradesh, you got Telangana, you got a number of states, Tamil Nadu, which are both coastal and are led by dynamic chief ministers who can actually then work towards solving these land-related problems. So again, luckily there is also enough time there. When we are talking 2047, there is almost about another 24 years or 23 years of time ahead. So I think it is something that that the government can address.
Super. With that, let's go back to the global stage again. And here I would like to tap into your experience, having been so involved with the G20. India's had a growing role within the G20, particularly after the success of the New Delhi summit in 2023. Of course, you've played an important role in shaping India's engagement during the presidency of Turkey, Germany, and China within the G20 platform. How do you see India's journey within the G20 over these years and through your involvement? And given the platform's importance and significance, and especially now this whole global South conversation that's attached to it, how can India best leverage a platform like G20 to support its own global economic aspirations, but also to be the voice of the global South?
Yes. No, very true. Actually, India has emerged as a significant player in the G20. I think, when I was the G20 Sherpa, we were still sort of emerging. We were clearly influential voice even then. And I know that particularly when I was leading the team in Turkey, that G20 was to be followed immediately by the Paris climate conference. And I know that, some of the European countries were dead set at completing the negotiation that they were supposed to have in Paris in Antalya, Turkey. And at that point, my job really was to do a bit of a pushback that, look, because they were focusing, European countries were focusing a lot more on mitigation. I felt that, countries like India, having relatively low levels of carbon emissions, in spite of its very large size, were more likely to be the victims of this what will fall out of global warming, which is so therefore adaptation had to be a very integral part of the negotiation. You can't just go and talk about mitigation. So we kind of sparred over that particular issue and all. And we certainly managed to prevail. We could defend our position. But since then, I think, India has grown much bigger also. Prime Minister Modi really has emerged as one of the very, very influential voices around the world. And that, I think, is the backdrop against which the G20 that India hosted took place. And that was, of course, a huge victory for India. Not only Prime Minister Modi in his usual style really turned it into a national movement. Because he held these meetings in all corners of the country. It's a large country, but, in my current job, I've been visiting, every single state. And everywhere you see the footprint of G20, one or the other event having been held there with great pomp and show. So there is that aspect to it. But also, I think, this was a time when the acrimony between the United States and Russia was at the peak because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Right. And the big challenge was to have even a communique on which both Russia and the United States will sign off. Even that actually was a huge accomplishment. Even the Indonesian one actually, which preceded, India had played a key role in brokering that communique in Indonesia. But by the time we came to New Delhi, I think things had deteriorated further. And so this was really a very skillful job by India's Sherpa Amitabh Kant and, of course, Prime Minister Modi. So big thing for India, in this communique, India also managed to, during the G20 conference, managed to bring in African Union as a full member of G20. That is a big thing for Global South. India also emerged really as a result of that, the voice of the Global South. It put on the map the women-led development. So a lot of interesting new things India brought to the table. It also brought to the table the restructuring or re-architecting, reforming the architecture of the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., recognizing the greater voice of countries like India and Global South in general. So a lot of new things. Brazil has carried that forward. So I think, going forward, the imbalance between the Global South and the North kind of is being restored.
Thank you for sharing that. With 2023 was certainly a momentous year, and G20 summit in New Delhi being the highlight. But since you mentioned the Paris Agreement and you talked a little bit about climate, we're curious to know, as India seeks its own long-term economic growth strategy, where does climate resilience and sustainability fit in? Climate change is something that is of extreme significance to South Asia region, and India is also extremely climate vulnerable. It impacts its key sectors, agriculture foremost. So, of course, India, you mentioned the net zero targets. India has its own net zero targets set. So how do you see the climate approach being made actionable and well integrated into its own economic growth sort of vision? One thing that came out last year was the climate taxonomy, which was promised to proceed this year, but we didn't hear so much about it in the recent budget. So what is your assessment of where's climate sitting in the economic priorities?
So I'll give you my personal view and then I come to India's.
Sounds good.
So to some degree, my personal view really on this is that India ought to really integrate its climate actions very much into its domestic environmental needs, which is that, some of the most polluted cities in the world, if you take probably top 8 or 9 out of 10 are in India. So really, the air that a large part of the Indian population breathes is very heavily polluted. If you look at the air quality indices, even today in Delhi, I haven't checked, but when I left about a week to 10 days ago, it was 300 plus, and the normal is 50. Good air quality is 50 or below air quality index. So it's quite a challenge. So I think, that's one of the things I'd like to say, that, look, and the advantage of that is that if it is really, if your mitigation strategy is really worked into your domestic objectives, then it is quite more likely to be supported by the people at large also. Because otherwise, you see, the whole thing is that this carbon emission is a global public good or global public bad. And it requires, therefore, action from all the countries in the world. And so there is and the governance is at the national level. If the governance were at the international level, then you could actually have an international agreement and all. But the very fact that we are having this problem with the Paris Agreement, right? With the United States having signed it and then unsigned and now, signed again and then unsigned again. That becomes a challenge. So I think if one really works the strategy into the domestic environmental objectives, it has greater chances of success. Having said that, I think, the Prime Minister very much believes in making contributions to the climate protection. But he also, I think he often refers to the Indian tradition that, look, you should take from nature only as much as you can put back into it. And so, nature is there to be nurtured also while you benefit from it. So he believes in it, and therefore he was very quick to actually adopt, the net zero by 2070 target for India. Good thing is that for India, the objective of energy security is very much tied into the climate goals also, because India doesn't have a whole lot of its own fossil fuel energy. Energy security for it, therefore, naturally means relying on solar, wind. And now I think, nuclear door is also, it seems, is opening up. In the recent current budget, very few people have noticed, but there is a promise now to revisit the liability law. And if that can be fixed, then of course a lot of the private investors from the United States will come to invest actually. And because the technology has not so much improved, these smaller nuclear plants are absolutely safe. So I think there is significant room now for India over the next 20 to 25 years to expand its nuclear energy production as well. So those three, I think, solar, wind, and nuclear will provide the roadmap towards energy security, self-sufficiency, and that of course also works well in terms of green energy, in terms of non-fossil fuel energy. So I think we will see that progress happening, but at the same time I also feel that India has to pay as much attention to adaptation as to mitigation, because whether or not we like it, actually the impact is already happening. And as I visit as a part of my Finance Commission work, a number of different states, particularly the hilly states, Himachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Sikkim, all the other northeastern states which are hilly, you hear this constant. Even in the plains, in Tamil Nadu, for example, even the day we visited there was massive rain, that several inches of rain within a couple of hours. It was very heavy rain that fell, and that immediately causes damage. India's drainage systems are not very in the best of the shapes in the cities. So all that needs to be addressed, because ultimately you've got to be prepared for what is coming, in spite of all the efforts that are being made at mitigation. Global warming is a reality. And the impacts of it are being felt already. So adaptation is very important. Also, one last thing is, of course, that part of the whole process of economic development is about adaptation. Your capacity to deal with these challenges of nature get much better as you grow richer and richer. One of the things that happens is that transportation networks become better, infrastructure gets better, roads are built up, and people have the means of transportation, automobiles, buses, etc. So when it comes to moving population from affected areas to the unaffected areas, that kind of infrastructure is very helpful, and that's part of economic growth and development. So in some sense, this adaptation is also tied very much to the economic development itself.
Thank you for that. And I do think that for greater mobilization of private capital towards climate finance, that is going to be an important aspect as well, especially from an adaptation perspective. Yes. India has an important and growing private sector.
Right. And that's where I think, in a way, the promise of the global community has not been realized, because all kind of climate finance has been promised, but hardly any has been forthcoming. So in a way, the global community also has to step up and take the necessary steps so that climate finance becomes available, so that ultimately it has to be a two-way street.
So just to wrap up, I have to talk about U.S. India ties. Yes. Since Prime Minister Modi met with President Trump in a high-stakes meeting last week, largely seen as a substantive meeting with important outcomes, one of them being $500 billion trade goal by 2030 that these two countries want to achieve. And all of this conversation happened around that big tariff and reciprocal tariff and trade deficit debate that has been surrounding the ties and the conversation around it ever since the new administration took office. I would like to get your thoughts on this. How do you see the future of U.S.-India economic ties in particular, and how actionable are some of these commitments?
Yeah. So I think this is a very important area. There's also some clarity will come in the next few months, and we'll know in the end from India's point of view, particularly how this plays out is going to be quite important. Both the United States and India are seeking to distance themselves from China in terms of trade intensity. That, of course, means that, if they're both trying to move away from China, naturally, then for India particularly, U.S. is the large market, with which, and Europe, of course, as well. In this sense, I think it's, there is a happy kind of ending which is possible, but we don't know how it is going to unfold. Now, it is quite clear that so far President Trump has followed up on practically everything that he had said during the election campaign that he would do. So he's quite credible in this sense. So when he speaks of the reciprocal tariffs, I'm inclined to think that they're coming. Now, reciprocity here means that the tariffs that the United States products face in India, which are significantly higher, would become the tariffs that the Indian products face in the United States market. Now, if that happens, of course, you know what will happen. First of all, if the resolution takes the form of actually the United States imposing these very high tariffs, then it is inevitable that India will actually react by retaliating. In a way, from a political perspective, it doesn't leave much of a choice for India. It will have to, as it did when the steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed on India during President Trump's first term. So India ended up retaliating at that time, and the U.S. then withdrew also its GSP tariff preferences at that time. I think that will be kind of very unhappy, very sad outcome out of it, and certainly it will not help this goal that you mentioned of $500 billion in bilateral trade between the United States and India by 2030. It'll do exactly the opposite. It will reduce rather than expand trade if that is the outcome. But there is a happier path to it, that the two countries negotiate, in which India lowers its own tariffs, which it can do. It has begun to do, by the way, even in this communique, that joint statement that was issued by Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. Bourbon tariff was reduced. India sort of offered to reduce the bourbon tariff from 150% to 100%. So there is a goodwill gesture done by India there, and hopefully more will be forthcoming. I think that will be a lot better outcome of this threat of reciprocal tariffs that India rolls back. India, by the way, also rolled back several of its tariffs during in the current budget, and that may also have been partly anticipating that the United States is now pretty much on this reciprocal tariff path, even though it had not been announced yet. But certainly, in President Trump's campaign speeches, etc., he had always said that he was going to go that route, and he certainly had been also pointing finger at India in terms of being one of the countries which is more protected. So some of that action also was taken in the budget by India. So there seems to be some inclination on the part of India to negotiate its tariffs down, but it will also need some concessions by the United States. It cannot be one-way concessions. That, I think, is the ultimate kind of outcome that has to be, because ultimately the Prime Minister also has to be able to go and be able to declare victory for him. And that means getting some concessions, which the United States can give actually under the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, which concessions which they had withdrawn, they could restore, but they could go further, farther than that, and grant more tariff concessions than India originally had under GSP. So there is, I think, a win-win deal which is feasible. And if that happens, I think, that will be good actually for India, good for the United States, and good for trade in general.
So it's really a win-win. If the two countries can achieve it,
yes,
the outcome looks promising. And I think that's the idea, to negotiate the first tranche of a mutually beneficial multi-sectoral trade agreement in the coming months. So I think we'll all wait and watch how that turns out and how much of the economic side of things impacts the relationship overall, which seems to be on a positive trajectory, and there is optimism around it. But thank you once again, Dr. Panagariya, for this very insightful conversation and for your time today. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. Hope you found this conversation as interesting and engaging as I did. Please stay connected with the Asia Society Policy Institute. Subscribe to our newsletters, including our South Asia Snapshot, and we'll catch you in the next one.